The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, Part 2. The long stretch of the centuries into millenniums made it easy to delete some of the most significant developments in those early ages in Egypt. The emergence of great leaders and long periods of remarkable achievements were followed by weak leaders and long periods of national disorganization and chaos in such amazing cycles that it seems that some relentless social political law was operating in the land. Centralized government, first instituted by Menes, always collapsed as civil war spread over the provinces and constituent kingdoms. One of the worst and most faithful periods of crisis was during the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties, 2181 through 2040 BC. What happened during this period of political anarchy is typical of the unproclaimed processes that slowly but steadily changed both the political and ethnic character of Egypt, and in the end, that of all the Black Sudan as well. During this period, as in many others, the blacks played a leading role in expediting their own downfall, a fact as important in their history as anything else. In Egypt, it was almost an endless power struggle, both within the royal lineages on the national and provincial levels and between the various provinces. The civil strife became more intense and bitter as the largest and strongest provinces, such as Thebes, tried to force the others back into a state of national unity. The trouble was that too many nomarchs, chiefs, were trying to do the same thing, each ambitious to become the pharaoh of all Egypt at the very least, and all Ethiopia if possible, Egypt and the Sudan. Hail reigned in the center of the empire, Upper Egypt, for 141 years. 141 years of retrogression and destruction. Both ends of the empire broke away from the center. The northern end, white Lower Egypt, became independent again, and more whites spread over Upper Egypt, taking full advantage of the general upheaval and promoting it by forming alliances with various provincial chiefs in the warfare against others. Since Lower Egypt also had internal strife among its now independent provinces, Delta chiefs did not hesitate in accepting the invitations of Black princes to form alliances and lead troops into Upper Egypt. Asians also marched across the desert from Libya, where they had also replaced the indigenous blacks and were now the dominant population. The steady transformation of black to brown to white becomes even clearer if it is remembered that after the unification of the two lands, the whites of Lower Egypt had very legal right to travel and settle in Black Upper Egypt, and while there was always a general opposition, there had been taking a steady infiltration from the beginning. They, like their Libyan kinsmen, always came in a manner that never caused immediate alarm, small numbers spreading out, and then gradually forming separate communities next to an African village, town, or city. They became an internal part of life in the provinces, actively supporting the local chiefs, marrying into their families, and by doing so, in time becoming legitimate chiefs themselves. The Asian power base was thus firmly established in provinces, and established so slowly and without fanfare that it appeared to be an imperceptible development. The same changes have been taking place on the national level in some of the royal families, but the biggest changes in the racial character of Egypt always occurred during the crisis periods of political decentralization and civil disorder, when the whites came in hordes and spread over the country. The already established Asian communities served as magnets, but the overflow of settlers caused the building of numerous new communities. They could now move in unchallenged. They came in not only from the Delta and Libya, but from Asia also. These were not military invasions, but invading settlers. They were like the John Baptists, the forerunners, came later from Asia and Europe. These could now count on cooperation and welcome from the white population already in Egypt. A century and a half of this followed. A pause and reflection are required here if the full significance of what has been set forth above is yet to be grasped. Yet the picture need not to be as confusing as many writers have made it of omitting salient facts. Among these are the following. The collapse of centralized authority from Memphis not only enabled Lower Egypt to become independent again, but it also meant that this predominantly Asian region was in the same state of disruption as the rest of the country. Kings in Lower Egypt ruling from avarice or Sais always claimed to be kings or pharaohs of all Egypt without having gained control of the whole country, just as the kings in Upper Egypt ruling from Thebes to Memphis made similar claims during the same period without having gained control over the whole country or even all of Upper Egypt. This point is highly important, for what it means is that there were periods when both white and black aspirants claimed to be pharaohs of Egypt at the same time, when none actually had effective control over the nation. Writers, knowing this well enough, have nevertheless generally presented the whites and Afro-Asians classified as whites as the Egyptian pharaohs, while ignoring the African pharaohs altogether. Their defense, when pressed, is that the African pharaohs are indicated as Thebians, Memphites, etc., satisfied, as previous pointed out, that the use of these terms is a part of the blackout of black history. 4. The periods during which the Asian incursions were the greatest, such as 2181 through 2040 BC, should be stressed because these population pressures caused a steady withdrawal of non-integrating blacks southward below the First Cataract. 5. To overlook this early separatist movement among the blacks is to neglect one of the most important keys to the fuller understanding of black Egyptian history. But just as the blacks had withdrawn in large numbers from Lower Egypt as it became more and more white and began to settle beyond and what became the borders between Lower and Upper Egypt, so now they had been moving from place to place in Upper Egypt in the futile effort to escape from the ever-pressing whites. These were the blacks who finally joined others in the south, Nubia. Nubia therefore revolted and became independent during the same period of the general collapse at the center, but the compelling reasons, as stated elsewhere, appear to have been resistance not only to the increasing Asian power in Upper Egypt, but also to the African and Afro-Asian pharaohs whose integration policies promoted the spread of this foreign power in what had been an important region of their homeland. It was black separatism and racism without apology. It was even something more than a resistance movement against the political domination of foreigners and social degradation of the blacks that always followed. But it was a stubborn resistance to the extinction of the race itself through amalgamation. And these were the first of the race for whom black was in fact beautiful and not just a catching slogan of the day. The expansion of white power from the Delta into Upper Egypt had been going on slowly long before the age of weak kings. They had been appointed as ministers, court officials, and various kinds, trade commissioners, army officers, and soldiers. The 90-year reign of Pepi II, the longest in history, was in their favor, for while Pepi had been a strong leader and a mighty king during the first 50 years of his reign, the general upheaval began when he had become too old to govern or even know what was going on in the country. This uncommonly long reign made the Sixth Dynasty the introduction to the era of chaos. This was the period of simultaneous dynasties of Asia, Libyan and Theban pharaohs, and several different capitals. There were so many kings during the 9th and 10th dynasties, and very short reigns that many of their names are unknown. Finally, the line of African kings ruling from Thebes first overcame the powerful Asian dynasty in Upper Egypt that were centered at Heracleopolis, and proceeded with the awful task of uniting the empire again. Strong rulers had began to emerge again in 2133 BC, so the 11th dynasty and the great Mentuhoteps began 93 years before the 10th dynasty ended. A further illustration of point previously made. Mentuhotep II was probably the greatest of the 11th dynasty kings. It was he who undertook to settle the white Asian problems forever by reversing the policy of integration and expelling them from Lower Egypt. Historians of that period write that he did expel the Asians from the Delta in 2040 BC. This too is misleading. While he did indeed conquer Lower Egypt again, and probably believed that reunification with the Black South would be easier if he first drove out the Asians, he was now 1,000 years too late for such a task. The Asians could not be expelled in any event, for all Lower Egypt was overwhelmingly an Asian population and had begun so far centuries beyond record. Nobody knows at what point in time they became the dominant people. What Mentuhotep did was to put the government to flight, along with its army and other known supporters. Besides, the Asians were now dispersed all through the provinces of Upper Egypt. The compelling reason for the reconquest of the Delta was always economic. In fact, race itself was an economic factor. When Asians controlled a commercial blockade, kept blacks from direct world trade and international relations in general. Therefore, the second reunification in 2040 BC ushered in another golden age in black history. African ships of commerce sailed the seas again. Nationwide reconstruction was pushed, and the revival of learning, science, and the arts and crafts marked the 11th and 12th dynasties. The black world could learn from its history is that there was an economic development base for each and every advance. Meanwhile, the blacks concentrated in the South had firmly fixed the dividing line between themselves and their borders in Upper Egypt at the First Cataract. This too meant war, because the South was the richest region in mineral resources. The long war against Nubia began during the 11th dynasty and went on year after year without success. A very real problem now was the attitude of the black troops from Thebes toward a war against their brothers in the South. In any event, no progress in overcoming the South was made at all until the power center at Thebes was moved to Al-Fayoum in the 12th dynasty. Even then, the war dragged out for another 50 years before the region bordering on Egypt, called Lower Nubia, was brought under control. Henceforth, the country from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean was definitely called Egypt, and the country from the First Cataract southward was definitely called Ethiopia, Nubia, Kush, etc. The end of the 12th dynasty in 1786 BC ended nearly 3½ centuries of great leaders and therefore great progress. Yet once again the cycle of disaster returned with the 13th dynasty. Mentu Pygmies sat on the thrones once occupied by giants. Nearly 2 centuries of internal strife and decay followed. Lower Egypt, of course, had quickly become independent again for the 3rd time. This meant an increased and unrestricted flow of Asians into the country. A period of turmoil was also the opportune time for great armed invasions. Among these invaders were the Hyksos, the children of Israel, according to the historian Josephus. This invasion of Egypt in 1720 BC was ruthless and aimed at nothing less than the extermination of the Egyptian people and their replacement by the Israelites. They did not succeed in this, but settled down to rule the country as the 13th and 16th dynasties, and stayed on as a powerful influence for over 400 years. The important point here is that the Semites poured into Egypt following its conquest by fellow tribesmen, and that this still further advanced the Asiatic character of the Egyptians. Hyksos' power was broken during the 18th dynasty, and many were expelled. They returned to Palestine and founded Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Egypt was developing into the new empire, and during the same dynasty in which the Hyksos had been expelled, they struck back by conquering both the Hyksos' homeland and Syria and extending those conquests to the Euphrates. It should be noted that the greatest Hebrew invasion of Egypt occurred about 600 years before Moses and the captivity. One reason why the great issues in African history must be both reviewed and expanded is that anyone who dares to challenge the prevailing and widely held viewpoints is in a position far more precarious than that of little David facing the towering and mighty armed Goliath. Here, an almost universal army of giants standing steadfastly in defense of the Africanist ideologies they must have developed must be combated. To this end, I review positions already stated in order to be crystal clear, and I expand by introducing additional facts on the same subject. Indeed, I might be properly accused of overemphasizing one point on which most scholars are already agreed: the great antiquity of African civilization. But the greatest of all issue lies here in the general agreement that at the very earliest period known to mankind, an African civilization in the areas later called the Sudan and Egypt was fully developed with all the arts of civilized life already matured, its beginning being placed so far into the early history of the world that it is beyond the reach of man. Since the most compelling evidence for scholars to these conclusions in recent times, the prevailing racist theories of history created a very real dilemma. How, in view of civilization beginning in the land of the blacks, can one explain their role in world history? Having successfully degraded the black race throughout the world and supported the degradation with their science and religion, how may one explain that this same black race was the first builder of the very civilization of which the Caucasians themselves are heirs? White scholarship solves such problems very neatly and with a blink of an eye. In this case, they very simply put the white man in Africa before the black man, and apparently not feeling secure enough with this, they overrode geography itself and took Egypt out of Africa, making it a part of an Asian Middle East laughter and tragedy. For, of course, a racism so extreme that it becomes ridiculous also becomes assuming, even though it is at the same time the tragedy of an unabated 20th century assault on blacks. The discovery of the earlier civilization, and therefore the most advanced nation, was in Africa, led white scholars to do a quick turnabout, going far beyond transformation the indigenous people into whites. They made Africa the birthplace of the entire human race, and, to please God, rushed back to Noah's sons again for a theory of racial origins and dispersions. But now Africa over the earth, Western scholars, in the absence of solid facts, do not hesitate to use myths and legends if these severe purposes. So in addition to the legend of how the different races came to be and then migrated, we also have quoted the Egyptian legend of how the god Tum assigned colors to the various groups. Sir Gardner, in his 3 volumes of Ancient Egypt, follows the same well-known line about Egyptians as Caucasians. In this, he is quite in step with most Western and Asian writers on the subject. Indeed, in addition to the evidence cited above, he relies also on Caucasian features in certain Egyptian monuments, portraits, etc. The head carvings, pictures, and other representations of people are quite true, depending on the period in which the work was done. What is done during the long era of classical representation when all portraits were of standardized form. The subject was idealized in an artistic attempt to make him look quite different than he actually was. In fact, a true representation of the individual who considered vulgar. The complementary question is, were the wall paintings and the similar depictions done during the periods of Caucasian ascendancy, Asian and Afro-Asians? For during the periods both African and Afro-Asians ruling and upper classes were classed as Asians or Caucasians, and a sharp distinction was made between themselves and the non-integrating blacks. They stylized paintings also to show the blacks in the same unvarying patterns. The first known revolt against this ancient system was of classical art that came during Akhenaten's religious reform in the 15th century BC. Anyone examining these early paintings will readily see why African history is so confused and so often misleading. One example is a wall painting in a tomb at Thebes, the oldest city of the blacks. The picture shows Negroes presenting tribute to the chief minister of Thutmose III. If one did not know that all the Thutmoses were of African lineage, he would naturally conclude that Egyptian civilization was in fact a Caucasian civilization, and the blacks, where they appear on the scene at all, were in a distinctly inferior role. Were not the paintings conclusive evidence of this? Look at their scanty, almost barbarous attire. References have been made to Thebes, and they may have been seen to be almost passing references. Yet Thebes was the most important single city in the entire history of the black people. The whole series of lectures could be properly based on Thebes. The history of black Africa might well begin at Thebes, for this was truly the eternal city of the blacks that presented the most compelling evidence that they were the builders of the earliest civilization in Kim, later called Egypt, as well as the great civilization in the south. The foundation of Thebes, like the black state of which it was the center, goes back so far in prehistory that not even a general Stone Age period can be suggested. This city is another example of what was meant when I suggested earlier that research workers should shun the enemy authorities because they themselves inevitably present factual data that contravene positions previously taken. I am not speaking about those scholars who present the various conflicting theories and viewpoints of the different schools of thought. It should be needless to say that this is desirable, or that reference is not made to such writers, but reference was made to those historians who espoused such doctrines as that of an indigenous white African society before the arrival of the blacks in Africa, while later on unwittingly showing that such could not have been the case at all. So almost all are forced by evidence could concede on one place or another, and often in very guarded or ambiguous language, that the blacks were also called Thebians because all Upper Egypt was for centuries called the Thebal after its greatest city, Thebes, and its people, the Black Thebians. That the Thebal also referred to the city itself as the intellectual center of black Africa, the chief seat of learning, of science, religion, engineering, and the arts. Thebal, therefore, could mean the whole of black Egypt or the university city, depending on the inflection of the voice. That the Asian whites were held rather firmly in the Delta region they occupied in Lower Egypt until the unification of the two lands under Menens, and that much heralded Egyptian dynasties were African founded and were nothing more nor less the African traditional lineage system, matrilineal in character, except when it was made patrilineal after Asian conquest or the greatest Egyptian transformation. I have said that the confusion in African history did not develop accidentally or because of a long series of unfortunate circumstances. The confusion seems to have been deliberately contrived. All specialists of ancient Egypt whose work have been examined were quite familiar with all of the facts presented here. I present nothing here that would be new to them, for so much of it is their own findings. Consider how much confusion and misinterpretations would have been avoided if they would have stated the well-established fact that the Ethiopian Empire still included most of Egypt, even after the Asian occupation of the Delta, that it extended southward over northern Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia, and that these states, such as Mawat, Nubia, Kush, etc., were like Egypt, lesser divisions of that vast empire. Even in the works where this is presented in various and sundry ways, you will not find a single map showing the extent of the Ethiopian Empire. To present maps of ancient Ethiopia, of course, would have defeated all major efforts to destroy or disguise the major significant aspects of African history. All honors must go to the ancient Greek and Roman historians who did not seem to know what racism is, certainly not as it developed in modern white civilization. They, in dealing with Africa, simply told it like it was. Pliny, Herodotus, Diodorus, Eratosthenes, Plutarch, Ethel, along with the Bible, all refute the interpretations of the African history by modern Caucasians. They eagerly quote the ancient historians as first-line authorities, but attack them wherever their records upset the premises upon which modern racism is built. In such a case, the Western scholars feel so absolute and infallible in his well-centralized power and control over science and education that on those points he does not choose to accept. He would dismiss the father of history with here Herodotus must be read with caution. He is known to have made errors. He did not travel very much to Africa. It is very likely that Diodorus was relying on oral tradition here. They may have confused the Greek Ethiopia, which means the black land, with Kim, Egypt, which also means the black land. For Pliny suggests that the case of Egypt black refers to the soil rather than the people, and so it goes. Throughout the study of the black man's history, we may find ourselves constantly misled or puzzled if we forget that practically all of the names of the terms to use are not African names and terms, but Greek, Roman, Arabic, Anglo-Saxon, etc. Some of the more recent pre-European and pre-Asian African names, however, have been rediscovered. One of these earlier names for Thebes was the Na'amun of the Bible and ancient Hebrew writers, but the African name was Wasi, and like the Greek Thebal, referred to all Upper Ethiopia or Upper Egypt. The blacks also made the distinction between Wasi and Thebal in no way, Thebes, the university city. Another point of the highest importance here is that the African name for Thebes not only comes from the south, as Nims point out, but the name itself is the name of the imperial scepter of Ethiopia, a golden staff riveted with ostrich feathers at the top. Here then is a single name that all by itself gives far-reaching insights into the history of blacks, and this is why I have urged that high on the list of research fields yet to be explored, there should be one devoted to the rediscovery of African names and their meaning. For obviously much of the African past was rather effectively by blotting out African names along with other indexes to black achievements. The determination of ancient African names and their meaning will spearhead a real black revolution, because it would lead directly to the emancipation of our still enslaved minds. It would be the great intellectual reawakening of a people whose world outlook through Caucasian eyes has been dimmed. I cannot now, for example, switch to the use of the African names I know in this discussion. I must continue to say Thebes, not Wose or No. The reasons are obvious, but if the kind of suggested research is done, the next generation of black writers will be using African terms freely and understandably, and with the maps redrawn to show places with their own original names. But let us never forget the central fact about Thebes, not even for a moment, for if the blacks had never left a single written record of their past greatness, the record would still stand, defying time, in the deathless stones of Thebes, of her fallen columns from temples, monuments, and her pyramids, a city more eternal than Rome because its foundation was laid before the dawn of history, and its plan was that, copied by other cities of the world, if the blacks of today want to measure the distance to the heights from which they have fallen, they need go no further than Thebes, the mother of cities, as it was called, one of the chief centers of religion in Africa. The blacks were a very religious people and had quite a number of religious cities, each one under the special patronage of a god, goddess, or any number of deities. The god and goddesses of Thebes were among the most important because their city was so important, because religion to Africans was far more than the ritual reflecting beliefs, but a reality reflected in their actual way of life, development of all of the major aspects of black civilization. The belief in immortality was a simple matter of course and beyond the realm of debate. This belief in life after death was the greatest inspiration for building on a so grand scale, attempting to erect structures that would stand forever. Necessity therefore gave birth to the mathematical sciences required for building the amazing pyramids and the architectural designs for the most elaborate systems of temple building the world has ever known. As the city of Ammon, the king of the gods, and of his wife, the great goddess Mut, the temples and the monuments to them alone had to be on a massive scale. There was also the war god of Thebes, the source of the power of the mightiest armies, the proudest and most fearless warriors. From this center of the empire alone, 20,000 war chariots could be put into the field. The hierarchy of deities not only included numerous lesser gods and goddesses, but also a long line of venerated former kings, queens, and ancestors. All of this not only inspired endless temple building at Thebes, but also a concentration on attaining the highest standards of excellence. This, in turn, called for reflective thinking, invention, and discovery. Many of these temples were what we would call colleges, as the different fields of study were temple-centered. Here, scholars from the foreign lands came to study, and from here, religious ideas and architectural design spread abroad. The early Greeks and Romans eagerly copied from both, reshaped them, and made them integral parts of an original Western culture. During periods of decline or conquest, Europe and Asia seized and transported from Africa as much as the artifacts of its civilization as they could. Cambyses, for example, as early as the 6th century BC, hauled away over 100 million of precious historical material from Thebes alone. Cambyses was only one of the countless thousands who invaded the tomb repositories of black history during each of the many periods of foreign invasions and foreign rule. For these tombs not only contain valuable historical records in different forms, but also great treasures in gold and precious stones. In these cases, the historical records were generally destroyed incidentally and not deliberately. The raids on graves and the great tombs were for the greatest treasures to be found there, but the stolen gold and other treasures were of no importance when compared with the mass of priceless historical materials that were scattered over Europe and Asia, some in museums, some destroyed or thrown away, all from the heartland of black civilization. Today, the descendants of the robbers still smugly declares the blacks never had any worthwhile history. If so, where are their records? The still interesting fact about Thebes is that many of its formerly greatest temples were prehistoric ruins, even 5,000–6,000 years ago. The most ancient temple at Karnak, for example, and what was the center of No, goes back beyond the reach of man's records. No other city on earth ever had so many temples. Even today, there are more ruins of temples there than anywhere in the world. Because of the splendor of their architectural designs and the colossal size of the structures, they, like the pyramids, became wonders of the world. Religion was not only the immediate occasion for the development of art and architecture, but it also inspired the drive for bigness, the grand design on a scale as huge as human skill and effort could achieve. Nothing less was befitting of the gods. The keeper of the temples of Thebes and elsewhere became a powerful priesthood, thus indirectly reducing the power and influence of chiefs and kings who, in traditional Africa, derived their real powers as the official intermediate between the gods, sainted ancestors, and the people. If an African king or chief had any real political power, it was acquired either by virtue of his religious functions or because of the prestige of being a great general and victorious warrior. Otherwise, the council was the constitutional center of power. Moreover, religion became the basis of political power in a subtle and much more far-reaching sense. For back behind the impenetrable curtains of time, true leaders saw the overriding mystery of religion as a controlling force in the lives of men. It appears that in almost all societies, religion was recognized not only as the principal means of social control, but the equally certain source of economic wealth and political authority. From the chieftain role of offering prayers and sacrifices to the gods, the steps of his own claim of kinship with the deities were easy enough. For who can gainsay one who is in exclusive communication with the Almighty? Although divine kinship was never widespread over the continent, it seems to be true that the ideas and practices of the divine despots of the Orient did penetrate and influence a number of African kings. The point of all of this is that religion made the people submissive and obedient, all the more so if their rulers was given a superhuman role, such as kinship with the gods and the protecting ancestors. For did this not mean then that the rulers held all the keys to heaven? Indeed, the chiefs and king had evolved into the very instruments of the people's salvation. The state incomes from religion stemmed from the requirement of sacrificial offerings from the people. This might be from 10 to 50% of what each individual produced or earned. But where the traditional constitutional law of the blacks prevailed, the people willingly contributed from their means for a quite non-religious reason. The central treasury belonged to the people and was maintained for the people's welfare, not only for the public projects, but for the relief of each and every individual in distress whose needs could not be met by his family or clan. However, African constitutional law received its first blow in Egypt in the wake of numerous invasions and foreign rule. followed later by its almost complete destruction by Muslim and European conquest. The ancient religion that gave birth to science and learning, art, engineering, and architecture, the resource for a national economy and political control, that same religion was the mother of history, writing, music, the healing art, the song, and the dance. The first historians were the professional storytellers and traveling singers. Both recounted the deeds of leaders, important events such as wars and migrations, and how and by whom the society or state was founded. Poetry and music were the creations of the people in general, and, like the dance, came so easily that they seemed to be in a natural heritage to everyone. As the various musical instruments and singing told a story, the dance also recorded a message, appealed for spiritual aid from God and ancestors, expressed joy for successful harvest, hunting, victories in war, or forms of prayer to ward off evil spirits that always sought to overcome the good. Sickness is one of these evils, hence the association of medicine with the spiritual forces for good. The ritual for appealing to a power beyond man is called magic by Westerners, that is, if they are discussing Africa. Exactly the same belief and practice are called divine healing and Christendom. The great civilization of the blacks, in which the four countless ages was centered around Noe, Thebes, did not just happen. Progress does not just happen automatically. Every forward step made by these early blacks was made, you may even say forced, by the imperatives of what led or what had to be done in order to survive. Bear in mind that the spiritual survival was one more important than physical, a concept the modern world is not expected to understand at all. The development of writing is not explained by the simple statement of a need to communicate. The idea of permanence seemed to motivate the drawing of pictures and symbols, which were the man's first step toward the art of writing. Significantly, the scribe arose in the holy temples, and this is why so many inscriptions of historical importance have been found here, on the walls, altars, and on colonnades. The world's oldest city, with the greatest number of temples that were also the oldest, must have been the place where the largest mass of historical data would have been found, had not the plunderers from different countries destroyed, stolen, and carried away so much of it. Here we need not be as much concerned with further testimony, such as that of Diodorus affirming that Thebans were the oldest first men on earth according to their tradition, and that they also originated the systems of philosophy and astrology. We need not to be much concerned about their antiquity, which was already well established, as we are about the loss of so much of the additional evidence concerning the development of philosophy and the beginning of the space science of astrology. Ancient Greek scholars, through Herodotus, referred to the completion of their education in Ethiopia with pride, and it appears as a matter of course, so much has been built up against the black race since those faraway times that it will be difficult for many people of today to realize that whites of the ancient world did not seem to regard the question of Ethiopia as the principal center of learning as even debatable. But we have to remind ourselves constantly, racism as we know it today was practically non-existent. When an ancient people boasted of their superiority over another nationally group, the terms of reference were conquest, political rule, and some kind of myth to legitimize that rule. When the fortunes of war enabled one white nation to enslave the entire population of another white state, no one believed that the conquered people were actually, that is, innately inferior. to the conquerors, neither did the relatively backward Asian whites who invaded Egypt consider themselves superior to black builders of the civilization they found there. The emphasis has been on Thebes as all Upper Egypt as Upper Ethiopia, and Thebes as its most ancient city and one of the very earliest centers of black civilization. We have said the earliest whites so regarded it. The Greek historian refers to Menes as the Theban and the first king of Thebes, meaning the Thebal or Upper Egypt, when it was united with Lower Egypt, and the beginning of the first dynasty, 3100 BC. The same historian noted that Menes' reign of 62 years was one of the longest in history, and that of his nephew, Ashathonis, ran a close second, 59 years. During this early period before Memphis was founded, the city of the 100 Gates spread 6 square miles over both sides of the Nile. It was also the city beautiful, being called by more different glorifying names than any city known to the ancient world. Its widest avenues, lined with sphinx, temples, palaces, and monuments, could accommodate any array of colorful chariots, 20 abreast. It was also the two cities, or the city of the living and the city of the dead. One was on the east side of the river, and the other was on the west side, each filled with the other in a race for magnificence. Palaces and mansions were largely concentrated on the east bank. Temples, being everywhere, were about as numerous in the city of the living as in the dead. On the west bank, where the monuments, temples of kings and queens were located, along with the various religious cults, the houses of priests, craftsmen, soldiers, and the masses. The West Bank was such a beehive of industrial, commercial, and religious activities that the city of the dead, even though it refers to the famous burial places, is nevertheless a very misleading name. Thebes' status as the capital city and center of imperial activities rose and declined, with few exceptions, according to the race or nationality of the ruling dynasties at the time. Being the center of black power, it was a main object for destruction by non-African invaders, and after they had achieved control, they established new capitals elsewhere. The importance of the city that had been the envy of the world was ignored, and many of its cultural activities were transferred elsewhere. No white pharaoh could feel either comfortable or safe in the center of the most heavily populated areas of blacks in the empire. The colored Egyptians generally felt the same way. Thebes was also eclipsed at times by the building programs of black kings in their drive to advance from the very old to the very new, and also for the purpose of securing a more effective centralized administration. The building of Memphis was for this purpose. On the other hand, Pianki and his successors in the 25th dynasty apparently preferred the capital of the city, Napata, in the deep south over both Thebes and Memphis. Was this because the holy city of Napata was like Meroe, the one great all-black city that had never been defiled by conquerors' hands? We may also speculate. It is clear, however, that Thebes reflected the shifts in power more directly. Whether or not the shifts were occasioned by internal or external forces, it declined as Memphis rose during the dynasties 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 3100 through 2345 BC. These were the first 5 African lineages to rule after the reunification. Therefore, was a further decline of Thebes after the 5th dynasty. and again for internal reasons of a quite different nature. Suffice to say that after the period during which there was an active policy of integrating Africans and Asians through the Memphis capital on their dividing line, the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, native kings generally sought to restore to its ancient glory the city so dear to the hearts of the blacks.